Blood for the Blood God and Skulls for the Skull Throne, let's talk about getting a World Eater's army together in 10th edition Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a start collecting video for World Eaters, talking through the faction with a few ideas as to how to go about start collecting an army, starting with why you might want to collect World Eaters in the first place, going over a few things that you can do to research and plan out an army, talking through first miniature purchases and the options that they can put on the tabletop right now, and a few thoughts as to rules and an example army list after that. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. Starting out, what are the major reasons that you might want to collect a World Eater's army in the first place? For the lore of the army, they're basically a blood-mad legion of Chaos Space Marines dedicated to Khorne the Blood God, and their Khorne Berserkers are well known as the ultimate shock troopers of Warhammer 40k, charging into enemy lines, breaking them asunder with many heavy blows of a chain axe. The World Eaters have all the superhuman might of a Space Marine, but turned up to 11 with the Butcher's nails, cybernetic implants that increase their strength and aggression. In battle, they're utterly dedicated to melee combat, having limited fire support from shooting and things, and generally tend to assault the enemy lines en masse, and there are a few armies in Warhammer 40k that can defend against the sheer onslaught that is a charge from the World Eaters. Eightbound Angron himself has been active in current 40k and plenty of recent lore. The Red Angel himself is capable of laying low entire formations of the enemy elites, and when banished returns to reality in short order to strike again. There are many splintered World Eaters warbands in the galaxy, with Angron maybe not having the greatest grasp on overall control of his legion, but are a mighty adversary wherever they strike. For the miniature range of the World Eaters, they're a newish range in Warhammer 40k, only really realised as their own independent Chaos Legion back in 9th edition. The release wave that they got at the time was kind of a small one, with just 3 main infantry kits and then 3 character kits, though I would argue that literally all of them are pretty nicely executed and pretty detailed, and they can back that up with a whole load of the more generic Chaos Space Marine offerings from the core range, though they can't take everything that Chaos Marines can field. It's strongly suspected that they'll be getting another release wave sometime in 10th edition whenever their Codex comes out, so maybe isn't the worst time to be starting a World Eaters army, already having quite a lot of cool kits updated, and knowing that there's likely going to be some more on the way. Plenty of things from the core Chaos range do feel pretty appropriate for them, things like Mauler Fiends, Rhinos and Land Raiders to get the troops into battle as well. And the Khorne Lord of Skulls is very World Eaters on theme, pretty appropriate as a Titanic demon engine for them. They could also ally in Khorne Demons if they want. Here's a quick look at a few notable models from their range. On the top left we've got the character choice Lord Invocatus, bounding over the enemy on the back of his flame-propelled Juggernaut. There's a World Eater's Khorne Berserker on the bottom left. The basic foot troopers of the army are fearsome adversaries in their own right. They can lay low entire formations of lighter enemy infantry with those chain axes. The hulking Khorne Lord of Skulls is sat at the back, powered by the blood of the enemies, a great big Titanic demon engine with huge tracks and a huge cleaver of Khorne. For some elite shock troops, we've got the Eightbound, basically the World Eaters version of Possessed there. The idea is that a World Eaters Marine is bound with 8 blood letters, and the resulting possessed mass is turned loose to destroy the enemy, propelled to unnatural levels of strength, speed, and violence. Then finally we've got Angron himself, the Demon Primarch of Khorne, a great big hulking centerpiece of a miniature, a leering demonic entity with his axe and sword in hand. As mentioned, beyond all that, you certainly can use some of the units from Codex Chaos Space Marines, things like the Chaos Predator or Defiler for example. These things are less on theme for World Eaters, though work fine painted in their colours. Quite a few of these kits tend to be a bit older. I feel like some of them hold up a little bit better than others. Pricing wise, compared with the majority of 40k armies, World Eaters tend to be sort of medium to goodish. Obviously all Warhammer's kind of expensive, but the World Eaters maybe have a bit of an advantage on that regard, tending to operate in quite small elite armies, meaning that you don't tend to need quite as many models on the board, and usually that translates to the pricing of them not being so bad. They're helped out a bit by Combat Patrol Box that gets quite a lot of points on the board. Between those two, they maybe aren't the worst, but perhaps aren't the single best in the game in terms of value. I feel like it's a bit easier to collect certain armies like maybe standard Space Marines, given all their discount offerings, or things like Grey Knights or Custodes for the absolute cheapest armies in the game. Finally, turning to gameplay, World Eaters are maybe a bit simplistic in how they play, generally tending to rush the enemy, and will play with a hyper-aggressive melee assault, so tend to be pretty dynamic and impactful when their units hit home, but also an army that you do need to be brave with. You can't just afford to play conservatively with them. They generally need to be jumping in and breaking down the enemy's screens and core units as soon as possible. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily easy to play as well. Often their units are a little bit fragile, so they need to balance using terrain to move up safely, and then using terrain as staging points to declare charges from. For their core mechanics, they get the Blessings of Khorne, meaning that you get to roll some dice at the start of each battleground and use a whole bunch of blessings on your units, either getting you extra speed, damage, or defense. And while melee is an absolute strength for them, it does mean that they don't really have quite as many good options for things like ranged combat. They do have ranged units, but they tend to be a little bit on the so-so side compared with other armies, and don't get much support from their detachment or their stratagem type rules. Power-wise, things tend to wax and wane quite a lot in 40k. At the moment, though, they're not really doing too badly, fairly strong with win rates of around about 50% or so, able to hold their own in grand tournaments. Overall, lots of good reasons to collect World Eaters, a big hyper-aggressive, melee-centric combat force, some fairly cool and nicely done models with the hope of more on the way, and pricing that maybe isn't the worst as 40k goes. If you do decide to collect World Eaters, then there's plenty of places that you can do a bit more research about them. Early on, it's worth having a good read through Index World Eaters, which you can download from Games Workshop. That will give you some ideas as to what the units do, and you could try and pick up the 9th edition Codex if you wanted a bit more on the lore and some pretty pictures and things. Otherwise, their Codex should be coming out later in 10th. Otherwise, the rules can be accessed via Battlescribe, New Recruit, Warhapedia or Games Workshop's app, plenty of places that host them free on third parties. And if you wanted to do some test games, you could try Tabletop Simulator if you're into that, or proxy some models in-game. Here on YouTube, there's loads of World Eaters stuff. I have made a few videos, including some army list compilations and a tier list and things. A few things might have changed a bit in them since they were from earlier in 10th edition, though I still feel like the majority of things are fairly on point. Elsewhere on YouTube, there's loads of other stuff like battle reports, painting guides, and plenty of lore on other channels. Plus, you could check out some dedicated World Eaters channels like the Red Path in particular, and Blog for the Blood God also has plenty of World Eaters content. They could be interesting enough ones to follow along. I'd also be tempted to follow along with social media. All the major factions have Discord servers, Facebook groups, and subreddits. Can just be a good way to see what other people are painting, what sort of discussions they're having in terms of building an army, and to ask a few basic questions to current collectors. Well worth seeking those out if you're going about collecting an army. When planning a World Eaters force, it could well be worth planning an 1,000 point or 2,000 point list just as a rough idea as to where you might wind up. Not necessarily something that you need to stick to religiously or anything like that, but can just give you a better idea as to what units you might get to try and reach your end goal. I'd say at the moment, with their range being kind of small, most World Eaters armies will look at least kind of similar. You're basically going to have some Khorne Berserkers as their base troops and the most iconic unit in the army, then likely using some Eightbound in support, and dipping into their cast of characters. I feel like there'll be a few more options on that front when they actually get their Codex. But even now I still feel like there's a fair few different ways that you could skew a World Eaters list to a little bit. You could maybe go for a sort of mechanized assault force with rhinos with berserkers in, maybe land raiders, disgorging elite troops, or perhaps use some things like Lords of Skulls, Demon Engines, or Allied Knights. You could make a surprisingly armoured force. You could potentially try and go heavy on just scout move rushing the enemy with loads of 8-bound and Lord Invocatus to have things moving up into the mid-board disturbingly fast. World Eaters certainly can perform some pretty hilariously scary first turn charges against an unwary foe. And I guess other decisions could be how much you want to have in terms of a balance of 8-bound versus berserkers right now. Do you want to go heavy on big possessed scary guys, or keep things more focused on the rank and file? And do you want Angron to lead your army or not? I'd say probably the majority of World Eaters players tend to get him, but not everyone wants every warband to be literally about the Primarch. Otherwise, you could just build to try and make an effective army in-game, go for the right balance of units to take apart the foe in the name of Khorne, or perhaps theme a force around a warband from the lore, or design one of your own. There are a few ones that have some slightly different characters out there, such as ones allied with the Black Legion, or one that fights in their Heresy-era colour scheme. Talking of paint, that's also something that's worth getting worked out fairly early. Likely painting up a Khorne Berserker will be a pretty good start on that front. As they go, they're fairly small investment miniatures that are pretty representative of the faction overall, and not quite as big a commitment versus, say, a big character or vehicle, where you might be putting loads of effort into a colour scheme that you've not 100% settled on. In general, Chaos Space Marines do tend to have pretty detailed, busy miniatures. One of the major features on them is quite a lot of trim with the red coloured armour plates, and then the trim in a sort of brassy colour typically for the World Eaters. It does mean that their models can take really quite a long time to get finished if you're going to go for that in the traditional box art colours. For some miniatures, it might make more sense to actually base coat in the trim colour and then block in the armour panels, certainly for very busy things such as the Helldrake. There's plenty of good painting guides online and here on YouTube. Games Workshop do have quite a few, but there's loads on other creators. It could well be worth just taking a look at how a couple of people execute their miniature designs and get a bit of inspiration for how you want to go about it yourself. World Eaters do have their iconic red and brass look. There's nothing to say that you can't paint them in your own colour scheme if you want to. There's loads of different warbands out there, some of which do have canon different colour schemes as I mentioned, or you can just make your own colour scheme if you'd like, or go for their more Heresy era colour scheme with the sort of white and blue shoulder pads. That's certainly a good option for showing up a bit of blood spatter if you want to make some. Moving on to actual miniature purchases though, currently I'd be tempted to start with either Khorne Berserkers or Combat Patrol World Eaters. The Khorne Berserkers do come in the Combat Patrol, so it's probably one or the other rather than both to jump in with. I'd say that if you are absolutely committed to going for a full-scale World Eaters army, I'd probably start with the Combat Patrol. I'd say the Khorne Berserker box is better if you just want to dip a toe in the faction and not commit too much money to it outright. But otherwise, if you're certain that you are going down the road of the World Eaters bloodshed, the Combat Patrol does have a good discount and it's probably worth it value-wise in the long run. Focusing on the World Eaters Combat Patrol first, GW's discount boxes are currently £100, €130 or $168, and as they go, the World Eaters are considered to have one of the best out of them at the moment. The 9th edition one was at least fairly generous, getting one Lord on Juggernaut, which can also be built as Lord Invocatus, a big 20 Khorne Berserkers, and then 10 of their blood-crazed cultist Jackals. As it goes for a Combat Patrol box set, it's a fair bit of plastic in the box, 31 miniatures, and one of them a big chunky cavalry one. It gets you quite a lot of points in the box, like around about 550-ish, depending on what you build as the HQ. And the discount versus buying the kit separately is around about the 36% kind of mark, and that's better than the majority of ones that Games Workshop has released for 10th edition so far. As it goes, given their model range, I think it's a pretty excellent start for the army. A nice focus on the battle line units, and both Berserkers and Jackals are very usable in game right now. The Lord on Juggernaut I'd rate as okay, Lord Invocatus is very good for the scout moves that he can bring. I feel like if you wanted to make a slightly more rounded Combat Patrol box set, I might have swapped out one set of the Berserkers with one set of the Eightbound. That might have felt just a little bit more rounded, but no complaints here with this one. It's definitely one of the more generous ones in terms of plastic in the box. For assembly options, I think if I was getting this to start World Eaters, I'd probably assemble the Lord as Lord Invocatus. As mentioned, I do feel like he is a bit better in game at the moment. I think his miniature as the sort of possessed Chaos Lord with Coward's Bane is a rather cool one. And then for the rank and file Khorne Berserkers, I'd take the maximum plasma pistols and the heavy two-handed Khornate Eviscerators wherever you can, given that War Gear's free and both of those just make them hit a fair bit harder, particularly the Eviscerators. When collecting World Eaters, I feel like this is the kit that you should go for if you want to land Khorne Berserkers. I think the discount on them is good enough to have this rather than buying individually. It certainly feels like a kit that you could buy two of if you wanted to. You could have the two different lords that way. 20 Jackals doesn't seem too excessive, though I must admit 40 Khorne Berserkers might be a bit of a daunting painting task. That's be a lot of power armour and trim to get through. I would say that's probably a little bit more than I'd ideally go for, at least until you built it into a big army. I feel like maybe a few other things might be a bit more high priority rather than massing out the troops for when you first start collecting. I'd probably go for one copy of this box and then build out with other options, with a few more danger units and maybe some transports, before I thought about getting a second copy of the box if I wanted to. When buying 40k miniatures, I'd certainly keep the various options in mind. Direct from Games Workshop's Warhammer web store is often the most reliable but most expensive. And in general, if you want to seek out new plastic, I generally tend to go by local discount retailers or online ones, basically official sellers who just sell the same things but directly cheaper than Games Workshop, so it's usually a bit of a no-brainer. There's plenty of those out there around the world, and I do have a few examples of them linked in the video description. Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21% off, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10% off, and Wargame Portal in the USA for 15% off. If you did happen to pick up any 40k models through any of those links down there, it does help to support the channel a little bit, with a small amount of the profits going to Auspex Tactics, so a big thank you to any of you guys using those, of course. Otherwise, remember that new plastic isn't the only option as well. You can take a look at the second-hand markets to see if there's any World Eaters or Khorne Berserkers going second-hand. There might not be quite as much of a developed market for them given that they're a slightly newer faction, but you might occasionally be able to land some kits at a small discount. Quality can be variable, but could also save you money and a bit of time potentially. Otherwise, in this day and age, 3D printing and third-party miniatures are also a thing as well. There's a fair few creators out there who've made their own version of angry men in sci-fi armor, maybe these gore lords from Store being a good example. If you do happen to have access to a 3D printer, or one of the people in your friend group does, could be a way to get some appropriate miniatures that could stand in for some units potentially. Getting back to the Games Workshop plastic though, I generally use the Combat Patrol if you want to get Juggernaut Lords, Khorne Berserkers and Jackals units, but beyond that there's plenty of other things to expand the army. At the moment, Eightbound are basically the elite damage dealers of the World Eaters. Khorne Berserkers doing quite well against infantry type units, those struggling with heavier stuff. It's generally them that are going to be needed to crack big tanks and knights and things. They move really quite quickly at 9 inches and then have absolutely brutal stats in close combat. The kit from Games Workshop is just 3 models for £40 or $62, so it is seen a bit on the expensive side there. I've seen a few World Eaters players convert 8-bound from Chaos Possessed if you can get your hands on some sort of chain weapon type bits. It is quite doable, maybe even just like getting 1 or 2 8-bound kits and then using some leftover bits to make a Possessed kit look very Khorne focused. Can just be quite nice to have a bit of model variety as well. Currently both variants are fairly equally good in game, I'd say. The standard ones gets to scout move innately and are a bit cheaper, pretty good for bullying enemy medium infantry and elite infantry, whereas the exalted ones are the true heavy hitters that can take down anything up to Imperial Knights. For the sergeant choices, I'd be tempted to go Lacerators on the 8-bound unit and the big brutal paired chain fist on the champion for the exalted ones. Maybe the other really big kit that World Eaters players often have in their sights would be Angron himself. The Primarch of the World Eaters is a pretty enormous miniature, but costs a pretty penny, £100 or $170. Less than this with the links in the video description, of course. Generally, he was a pretty well received model, a great big, angry leering demon, all ready to commit massive violence on the enemy. He can move really fast and can threaten to slay most things in the game in a single round of combat. He is quite a big investment and slightly more complicated centerpiece kit though. It's probably not the best place to start for a World Eaters army until we've got the base colour scheme down and a bit of experience with painting them. Definitely a bit more of a challenge to have the man himself look good. I certainly would pick up the Primarch at some stage though if starting World Eaters. He's currently near enough auto-include in competitive lists, just moving really fast and is fairly tough and break things quickly. Plus his special rule means that if you manage to roll a 666 on the Blessings of Khorne dice, then you can have Angron basically respawn in the game, which can be game changing or game winning. It's certainly unreliable for that to happen though. Otherwise, for higher priority options to expand, I'd be tempted to pick up Khan the Betrayer, a usable enough scary fighty character that tends to do pretty well against elite infantry with a damage 3 axe. And if you have picked up the Combat Patrol, I'd probably be getting rhinos to transport those Khorne Berserkers about. They tend to get on really quite well with a rhino as a staging bunker. It can move up into the mid-board turn 1, maybe behind cover, and then turn 2 your World Eaters can get out and charge down the enemy. Otherwise, the Master of Executions has been a fairly popular choice in 10th edition. He gives the unit fight first that he's attached to, and that's quite nice for Khorne Berserkers, makes them hard to charge, plus he can be fairly scary with the Berserker glaive. He's not quite as brutal as he used to be though, and he does pay a premium for his abilities now. As mentioned, the Khorne Lord of Skulls I think is a pretty usable super heavy if you want one. A great big massive tough threat that the enemy is probably going to struggle to deal with if they've also got Angron himself flying in their faces and making a nuisance of himself. Just very tough, kind of ridiculously scary in melee, and actually puts out some good firepower as well, which certainly is appreciated in World Eaters who don't have much of that. Another option you might be tempted by are Chaos Terminators, which at the moment I might be a little bit more wary about. As mentioned, World Eaters are suspected to get some more model releases in 10th edition, and at the moment we don't know whether or not new Terminators are going to be among that number. I feel like there's a pretty reasonable chance that they will be, given that people were so heavily expecting Red Butcher's Terminators when the first release came out, and were kind of surprised when they didn't materialise. Both the Thousand Sons and Death Guard have unique Terminators of their own, so it seems kind of likely that World Eaters will get some. I'm not sure whether or not they'll still be able to field this generic Terminator squad when that does happen though, if it does. And as a result, if you're collecting World Eaters at the moment, I'd probably skip Terminators or go light on them, focusing heavily on the Khorne Berserkers and 8-bound, which are absolutely guaranteed to still be core units in the Codex. Otherwise, for a fair few more generic Space Marine picks that maybe stand out a little bit more than most, Mauler Fiends are big, tough, and dangerous melee things that can take out tough stuff. Hellbrutes don't have the best stat line just at base, but they do get that rather spectacularly scary rule where they get to basically attack again whenever they get attacked by something, which does mean that if the opponent isn't careful, they could be handing you loads of extra damage by mistake. If you want a bit of dedicated fire support, currently Chaos Wardog Brigands do that quite well, though I'd bear in mind that allies rules maybe tends to change a bit more commonly than some things in 40k, so treat them as a bit of an extra as opposed to a core offering. I'd say the big scary Land Raider is usable enough, definitely a solid way to get Berserkers into combat if you want to, though I feel like most people tend to go for cheaper Rhinos, at least in more competitive lists, and Demon Princes often tend to be at least a fairly interesting choice. They'll often be one of the better places to use enhancements, so say a Demon Prince could use the Helm of Brazen Ire if they wanted to. Halving damage goes a long way to getting them into combat a bit more safely. Finally, for kits to expand, I thought I'd just mention the Exalted the Red Angel box set, which came out as a Christmas Battle Force offering. Games Workshop didn't really make many of these, unfortunately, so I think it's kind of unlikely that you find it at a particularly good price. I certainly weigh it up against the cost of individual kits bought separately from discount retailers, as that might just well be the best option versus buying this at an inflated price. It was a really good box set though, with Angron, a bunch of 8-bound and some Khorne Berserkers all in the same army. Kind of a shame that Games Workshop didn't make a few more of them really. Overall, just for ideas for expanding the army, in general there's a lot of scope for just collecting what you like the look of in Warhammer 40k. Rules change over time with lots of balance updates, though at time of recording pretty much all of the unique units are at least usable, and tend to be fielded in competitive armies in actually quite a good balance. I feel like Games Workshop have done well on that part. With balance updates they tend to focus far more on the unique stuff for the Deity Legions. I just feel like Khorne Berserkers, 8-bound and Angron are all maybe a bit more likely to be competitively relevant into the long term, as opposed to some of their more generic Chaos Space Marine ports. There's just maybe a little bit less pressure to get them right for World Eaters. I think maybe if I were trying to aim to build up towards a 2,000 or 3,000 point army list, maybe these could be some rough numbers of things that I'd aim for as a core of the force, perhaps something like 20 to 30-ish Berserkers, plus some Rhinos to transport them, 20-ish Jackals perhaps, maybe aim to build up to 6 each of each 8-bound type, though you could go more if you wanted, and then I'd quite like to have their unique character options to be able to field, Angron, Khan, Lord Invocatus, and the Juggernaut Lord. I'd say something like that would probably be the core of my force, keeping the heavy emphasis on the unique stuff, and then adding in a fair few more generic Chaos Marine options as I felt like, or as the models appealed. Having a rough 2,000 point army list in mind, and then building up in small jumps to make that happen, as opposed to just getting literally all of it in one go. All of this will be in mind for the World Eaters Codex that's going to be coming out in 10th edition. As mentioned, currently at the time of recording, Index World Eaters is freely downloadable on Warhammer Community under the download section for Warhammer 40k, and the points can be found in the Minotaur and Field manual next to it. You could potentially try and find some index cards to pick up as well. They can be handy enough for flashcard references to keep your unit profiles really handy in game. Bear in mind though that they'll only be good until the Codex comes out, and we don't know exactly how long that's going to be. We know that at the moment the 10th edition Codex won't be out until at least autumn 2024, and it could potentially be much later than this. It's not announced yet by Games Workshop at time of recording, though it'd be heavily odds on to be within the year from time of recording and release of this. I'd absolutely not wait for the Codex to come out though. 40k rules are changing literally all the time, and World Eaters are very playable and fun right now. I'd get started with a core of the army list. I think it's just quite a nice thing to have, to know that some extra miniatures might be coming for the army. It means that you could try and get a core of the force together now, get plenty of games in, and be ready to adapt a bit when the Codex comes out. It should give some extra detachments and fun ways to play. Plus of course some new miniature options. Current guesses are things like Berserkers on Juggernauts, a Berserker Surgeon character miniature, and maybe some unique Terminators. There could potentially be more as well. I think it'd be really nice to see some Khorne Demon engines and things. We did get a few hints of changes that might happen as per the core Codex Chaos Space Marines as well. Spawn are likely to be Objective Control 0 when Codex World Eaters comes out, so might be a little bit more peripheral than they are now. Finally, looking at current rules of the army though. As mentioned, the Blessings of Khorne table is on the right. Basically you roll 8 dice at the start of the game, and then you can look at your results and decide what combo of the different buffs that you can make out of them. Often the aim for a lot of people on the first turn might be to try and allow advance and charge and the +2 to move characteristics together, And between the two of them, it does mean that you could potentially have Angron and a whole bunch of 8-bound doing first turn charges if you wanted to, which is pretty brutal and hilariously scary for the opponent. Otherwise though, depending on the turn, lots of other options could be the right choice. Lethal or sustained hits are both pretty great depending on the right thing that you're fighting. A bit of extra defense doesn't really hurt too much at all. And fights on death could be very nice if you happen to be against a close combat orientated foe. In general, you are pretty much guaranteed to get something useful even if you roll low. The other main core rule is Relentless Rage, +1 to strength and attacks when you charge in. Again, a good reward for being hyper aggressive and making the charge on the enemy rather than the other way around. Otherwise, from their launched attachment, they've got a few other fun stratagems. +1 to wound against characters, monsters and vehicles can be nice for 8-bound units or for Khorne Berserkers. That's a nice easy extra damage increase there. And Apoplectic Frenzy for 1 command point is pretty massive in combination with that advance and charge blessing that we talked about. Just an automatic 6-inch advance means that even Khorne Berserkers could be charging ridiculous distances across the board. Very little is going to be safe from the Wrath of Khorne. I feel like the enhancements are maybe a little bit more so-so than when the edition started. The Berserker Glaive I still think is nice enough for a Master of Executions, giving you extra +1 to your attacks and damage. It does make him into really quite a pricey character though for the privilege. Favoured of Khorne could be alright for manipulating the Blessings roll a little bit, though it's only once per game, and Helm of Brazen Ire could be alright for a Demon Prince if you wanted one. Finally, for just one example of putting it all together, here's a rough balanced 2000 point army list, aiming to be around about 2000 points, though not precisely exact, mainly starting to go around from a first combat patrol box set, and then build out from there. Leading the force we have Angron the Red Angel himself, and Khan the Betrayer who'll be running with some Berserkers in a Rhino, and then Lord Invocatus who'll be able to scout up a bunch of 8-bound to go along with Angron and do some first turn charging. Then we've got 3 units of Khorne Berserkers, 2 units of 10 packed into Rhinos, one of them with Khan, and then a smaller unit of 5 of them to be a bit more of a second line troubleshooter sort of unit, aiming to walk up and hide behind terrain and maybe use their Blood Surge to good use. 2 units of 10 Jackals who can provide sticky objectives and be quite cheap chaff to bully enemy infantry, maybe do some actions in Pariah Nexus potentially. And then finally, for some heavy elite damage dealing, we've got 2 units of 3 8-bound and then 2 units of 3 Exalted. The Exalted ones going to be the things to try and aim to take down the very toughest stuff in the enemy army, just horrendous damage with their chain fists when they charge in. And the regular ones can scout and hopefully bully some medium infantry pretty well. Hopefully just the sorts of units that the opponent really can't afford to be fighting. Overall, I'd rate this as a fairly strong and balanced starter list right now, maybe not too dissimilar from what some people are running at tournaments. And it's quite nice that Games Workshop have managed to make pretty much all of their iconic units genuinely quite strong in game currently. In any case, hopefully some of that's been some inspiration to starting an army of angry red Space Marines, and as always let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Any tips from seasoned World Eaters players are certainly appreciated. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to check out other things like the World Eaters tier list that I'll leave links down in the video description, and otherwise check back for Auspex tactics if you'd like to see more. I do tend to post more 40k things just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all of these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.